a living history production.
I'm Matt McLachlan.
And I'm Pete Smith.
We're battlefield historians who love nothing better than getting out and walking the ground where great battles in history took place.
And now we'd like you to come with us. Every week, BattleWalks will take you to one of the great battlefields of Europe.
As we walk the ground, we'll dig through the pages of history. We'll uncover the secrets of the battlefields, and most importantly, we'll tell the stories of the people who fought and died there.
Welcome to BattleWalks.
Hello and welcome to another episode of BattleWalks. We are walking the great battlefields of Europe, and I have to say, having a great time doing it. Let's jump into this week's episode. It's a good one. It's going to be very particularly important to my co-host, as this is his stomping ground from where he grew up. There's a very big connection to where he's from in England. Pete Smith, welcome back to BattleWalks. Tell us what we're doing this week.
Hi Matt. Well, we're going to be following the Hull Pals, so we're going to talk about the raising of the Hull Pals, and then the action that I suppose is remembered most in Hull because of the terrible casualties. They're fighting at a place called Oppy Wood on the 3rd of May 1917. It's part of the bigger Battle of Arras, and then another part of the Battle of Arras. This is called the Third Battle of the Scarpe, the 3rd to the 4th of May 1917.
Now, we've touched on Arras a few times on the podcast. It is a big, wheeling, complicated battle. We talked about it when we did Bullecourt. We talked about it when we did Vimy Ridge. There's so many elements to this battle, and we won't in this podcast try to break the whole thing down. But suffice it to say that this is a huge battle that took place in 1917 and involved a very large number of units in a very big landscape. And I think this is the best way to approach it. What we've been doing, Pete, is just breaking it down into these small, manageable chunks, because I suppose at the end of the day, for the men on the ground, that's what the battle was. They were not particularly interested in the big strategic picture. They were interested in what was happening in that field in front of them.
I think most of them wouldn't have even had the opportunity. Even if they had been interested to know what was going on, they wouldn't have been told. We're still in the period where men weren't particularly briefed on the big picture. This was just, for them, an important action, and they knew what they had to do, and they needed to get it done. And I think that will remain very much almost to the end of the war. It's really in 1918 where the men have felt it's necessary to give them a better briefing so that they know a little bit more about what's going on. Actually, I'm wrong there. I was thinking, because this is just prior to the action that takes place at Messines, and Messines is really the first big action where the men are briefed properly. So perhaps we're getting close. We're getting close to the men knowing a little bit more about what was going on.
This is an interesting walk we're doing, because we're walking the ground in France where the battle occurred. But as we said at the top, there's a big connection to a place in England that is very close to your heart. So Hull, or Hull, as you say, Hull. For our Australian listeners who might not appreciate the Northern English accent. But tell us, where exactly are we? Let's talk about the UK first. Where is this place, and why is it important to you?
Okay, so we're in the north east of England. It's a fairly, I think, the third largest city. I'm not quite sure where it stands now, but for a long time, third largest city in the UK. Main trade, fishing. It's famous for fishing and whaling, going back a century, and whaling was big. Mainly nowadays, it's a direct route to the continent, so there's a regular ferry service from Hull to Holland and elsewhere. So it's still an important port. Sadly, the fishing's completely gone from being the number one fishing port in the UK. Now no fish are landed in Hull at all.
And this is the area where you grew up, I assume?
It's where I was born. So I was born in Hull, moved to a little village outside of Hull, and in fact, for that reason, we crossed the boundary and into the East Riding, and I actually went to Beverley, to school in Beverley, which is like the county town. Hull's the big industrial city. So I'm in between the two. My father was born in Hull as well, my grandfather. So Hull's my hometown.
Talk to me about the men who came from Hull and enlisted in the First World War and went off to fight, because it's a pretty significant part of the story of the British forces during the First World War.
Yeah, it is indeed. I mean, what we're going to be talking about are the PALS battalions, the units that were raised specifically for volunteer force for fighting in the Great War. So I'm going to take you right the way to 1914 and to what happened in 1914, because what became very, very obvious very, very quickly is we needed a national army, and we didn't have one, and we were going to be fighting a country or countries that had national armies. Germany, everybody did military training, they were all conscripted, and so it's an enormous national national army and we have this regular fighting force, very professional, but we need to expand it drastically. So the man that really recognised and is the man that we remember is Field Marshal Earl Kitchener, and he's pointing finger on those famous posters, "Your country needs you." Well, he is the man that really is tasked to try and recruit, to try and get these men to volunteer. And he starts very early. Britain went to war on the 4th of August, and on the 7th of August in 1914, we get the first basically enlistment posters trying to persuade people to volunteer. What we then get is, I suppose, an idea that forms. Now, there is some suggestion that it may have been the War Office that suggested it to a gentleman called Lord Derby. Or is that pronounced Derby? Derby. Always struggle with that one. I think it's Derby. I'm going to stick with Derby. Lord Derby. On the 24th of August, he received permission from the War Office to raise the Liverpool Pals, so the first of the Pals battalions, and that's where we start really with this. It's him, Lord Derby, who starts this process of suggesting that maybe cities, big conurbations, would like to raise volunteer forces. Even pay for them to a certain extent, pay for their uniforms, pay for their lodgings, get them all organised, and then hand them over to the military when they're at a certain state of readiness. And Hull had a reluctance to volunteer. There weren't that many volunteers in Hull in the early days, and so Hull, it's thought, is ripe for kind of suggesting that perhaps this would be a good idea. And one of the reasons we believe, certainly in the Hull Daily Mail at the time, people were reluctant to join up because they wanted to join up with their mates, and they didn't want to end up with people they didn't know. And so this is part of the key to this whole strategy of getting guys to enlist together. And so what we get on August the 29th, a chap called Lord Nunbenhome, his actual proper name was Charles Wilson. He's a local ship owner. He meets Kitchener and basically gets the okay to start raising a group of volunteer battalion. First of all, just one battalion to serve on the Western Front. That is going to expand rapidly because he's very clever. What actually happens is they decide, wouldn't it be a great idea if they could, as well as being geographic, these people are all going to be from Hull, they're all going to come from Hull, but wouldn't it be a great idea if we can actually split them down into also, I suppose, social levels? And so the 10th Service Battalion, which is the first battalion that's raised, becomes known as the Commercial Battalion. And that's because they're all commercial type guys. The 11th Service Battalion becomes the Tradesmen's Battalion. It's obvious what's going on here. The next battalion, the 12th Battalion, becomes the Sportsmen's Battalion. And then the final battalion, the 13th, is known as T'others. In the Yorkshire dialect, the others. In other words, they don't fit into any of the above.
It's absolutely fascinating, Pete, and I particularly like that idea that you could call yourself a sportsman, and because you were good at golf or tennis or hunting, and join up with other fellows who saw themselves in the same way. I should point out for our Australian listeners as well that we focus a lot on the PALS battalions coming out of the UK. A very similar system actually applied in Australia, that men from the same locality enlisted and went off together, and there were numerous sportsman battalions that came out of Australia as well. Probably the big distinction was the geographic areas were much larger in Australia, so there would have been less of that comradeship from being from the same local area, but it's still applied. Men from where I grew up, West Wyalong, actually where my family farm was at Mallee Plains, they all went off and joined the 20th Battalion. So if you served in the 20th Battalion, particularly early in the war, particularly at Gallipoli and in the early days of the war, you could be pretty confident that the men around you had at least enlisted from the district where you lived and worked. So it was the same loose system applied in Australia, just from much larger geographic areas.
I think this one as well, we often think that every single person here came from Hull, but they didn't. They came from further afield. They may sometimes have had connections with Hull, or they may have come from the larger East Riding, so East Riding of Yorkshire, East Yorkshire. But the titles, I'm just going to read the title because it explains the whole kind of gambit. It's the 10th Service Battalion. Service means that they're volunteers for the war. It's then brackets, 1st Hull, and then the East Yorkshire Regiment. So it doesn't even, in their actual official title, it doesn't even mention the commercials, and then they're known as the commercials. So it's a right mouthful, but it actually tells the whole story exactly of how that battalion, that's the 10th Battalion, has been raised, the first Hull. But as I say, they weren't necessarily all from Hull.
Before we get on to how they went during the war, there's something I noticed that was very interesting. Was Hull was actually bombed in 1915. Now, tell us that story. So while the men are off getting ready to fight and off in France, the Hull itself is coming under attack from the Germans.
Yeah, it's interesting, as it will be heavily bombed. I think it's the most heavily bombed city during the Second World War, and it's because of its docks and the fishing, because that's important for food. Well, in the First World War, it was also bombed by zeppelins. So it's one of the first places to be bombed by zeppelins. And I made a little comment in my notes here: is how would you feel if you'd been if you were a soldier serving either in France or in somewhere else in the UK, and discover that your hometown is being bombed from the air? And of course, that is part of the whole reason why the Germans are doing it. It's not because it's going to be a really successful weapon. It's a terror weapon. It's so high up that the bombing is indiscriminate in the extreme. And so it's a real terror weapon. And on the 6th of June in 1915, the Hull Pals were actually in training, and also on the coast. They were doing some defensive work on the coast. There was a worry at the time that the Germans may possibly invade. And of course, they then heard about that Hull was being bombed. And in fact, I'm just going to go to I've got a set of medals. I've been very interested in the Hull Pals for years, and I was given a set of medals by an elderly couple whose father had actually served in the Hull Pals, and I got to know them very well. And they gave me an account. Their father, who had served, had actually recorded an account, and part of the account I'm just going to read you here. It's been transcribed. It says, on June the 6th at 11 p.m, the alarm sounded and we turned out. This is when they're on the coast. They turned out, expecting the Germans had landed. However, when we lined up in the square, the colonel told us that reports had come in by telephone to say that a zeppelin was coming up the river Humber. Hull's on the banks of the Humber, with the intention of bombing Hull. That's one of the reasons it was bombed so heavily. It was easy to find this big estuary, guided planes coming from the continent to the city. We were given 10 rounds of ammunition and told to open up independent fire if the Zeppelin came over the camp. Being high up on the Yorkshire walls, we could see flashes of light over Hull, and those would be the bombs. It was during the night. We all had families in Hull, and the consensus of opinion was that we should all get back there. So you can see how it's unsettling these men. We were about 8 or 10 miles away, and there was no transport of any sort. The officers could see we were getting restless and told us that we were in telephone communication with Hull, and that anyone with families in the affected areas would be given leave the following day. So it's a good account to give you an idea of how that kind of bombing affected the soldiers both in France and in training in Britain.
Yeah, absolutely. We should say at this stage as well, for anyone who is new to the story of the First World War, Zeppelins are large German airships. There were no aircraft that could make the journey from Germany over to England at that stage of technology. So the Germans brought in these quite fearsome airships, these Zeppelins, and today you can find a lot of them were shot down, and it's quite collectible. You can find quite a few remnants and detritus from the Zeppelins. Quite a famous, and not as well known as it should be, chapter of the First World War.
Interestingly, why we get so many little bits of Zeppelins available is because they were cut up into tiny fragments and sold to raise money for various military charities. And so you could buy a little piece of a Zeppelin at the time. So it's a fascinating part of the war. I won't go into the whole story of it, but basically the Zeppelin menace finishes when we invent an incendiary round, because they're full of inflammable gas, and if you hit them with an incendiary round, then they're gone. And they will be eventually replaced by bombers, German bombers, which will reach the UK as well. But that's a story for another day.
So let's go back to our friends, the Hull Pals. Tell us a little bit more about them, Pete. What did they do early in the war? And then as we go on, we're going to do a walk around Oppy Wood, where they fought in 1917.
Yeah, it's more of a bimble list, because it's not a big area at all. It's just
a bimble.
A bimble. It's just
that sounds like a word that the Hull Pals would have known well.
Possibly. So where do we start? So obviously, then, or interestingly, they are not going to go to France to start off with. They expected they would. They trained and they were digging trenches and went down to Salisbury to do more training. Eventually, that's where they'll do their final training on Salisbury Plain, as most units did. And in fact, they're in an area that many Australian troops would recognise at the same period, Fovant. I think Fovant is where the big Australian crest is carved into the white the white.
It is
chalk.
indeed on the Salisbury Plain. A lot of Australians
Exactly.
were encamped here, and as did many of their British and New Zealand and Canadian comrades. They took the opportunity to carve into the chalk soil and left their marks behind.
Yeah, I can feel another podcast coming on. So a place called Herdicott Camp, which is near to Fovant, and that's where they did their final training. And then suddenly they're issued with tropical helmets. And so there's a clue there. They're not, in fact, going to the Western Front. They went to Egypt. So on the 30th of December 1915, all of the 4 battalions, 10th, 11th, 12th and 13th. So this is a brigade. So that's the next thing to say. The 4 battalions formed a brigade, the 92nd Brigade in the 31st Division. And the 31st Division is allocated to the Suez Canal defences. And that's what they're worried about. Very topical at the moment with this ship that's blocked the Suez Canal for several days. And they went to defend the Suez Canal from Turkish attack because they were concerned that the Turks may try and take it. And if they had done it, it would have caused us a big problem because as it did this blockage of the canal just recently, then it's something that most trade comes through there. Most of the soldiers coming from, well, Australians, some of them would have come through I'm sure some of them would have come through the Suez Canal.
Absolutely. All of them. So.
Yeah.
It's also interesting, we should note at this point as well, that obviously being in Egypt at the end of 1915, you asked the big question about Gallipoli, and it is true that the earliest assembled PALS battalions were sent to Gallipoli right at the end of the campaign. So it's so we always think of the Battle of the Somme as the time that the PALS battalions received their baptism of fire, but quite a large number of them served at Gallipoli right at the end of the campaign.
So they're going to spend their time there, and they hated it. You have to say they hated it. The discipline was strict. The food was appalling. The weather was hot, and they were desperate to get to grips with the Hun. So they wanted to be in France. So on the 16th of March, they get what they wanted, and they're shipped across to France. So their first battle they're going to be involved in is the battle that actually most of the PALS battalions get a blooding in, and that is the Battle of the Somme, the 1st of July 1916. And the 92nd Brigade with the 31st Division was tasked to attack Serre. Now, for anybody that's read anything at all about the Battle of the Somme, Serre is a terrible place for the Sheffield PALS and the Barnsley PALS and the PALS battalions. It's where we go to commemorate them. In fact, Sheffield has a memorial there in Serre. And the whole PALS were very lucky. They were held back. They were not used during that attack, apart from carrying parties. They take casualties, but they were very lucky that after the 1st of July and onwards into the Battle of the Somme, they were not too badly damaged and still had that feel of being a PALS battalion. Because one of the sadder aspects, of course, of raising a PALS battalion, it only remains a PALS battalion in that sense if you continue to supply reinforcements from the hometown. And of course, that was the big problem. In most hometowns could not continue supplying the reinforcements. So very quickly, that feel of it being just located with either Barnsley or Sheffield or one of the cities that's involved, it loses that quite quickly.
And the obvious thing we should say about the Battle of the Somme and the PALS battalions is that the PALS battalions are a wonderful idea from the point of view of recruitment and training and esprit de corps. It's a fantastic idea. But if a battle goes badly wrong, as the Battle of the Somme did, it is absolutely devastating for the towns where those battalions came from. If you imagine these battalions going out and losing a huge number of men from the same battalion, that means a huge number of men from the same streets, towns and villages are all lost at the same time. So the Battle of the Somme really left its mark, particularly in the north of England, and these towns that had worked so hard only a couple of years earlier to raise these PALS battalions, and then saw a huge proportion of the young men from that town killed or wounded in the same action. Just absolutely devastating.
You're absolutely right, and I'm going to go off not quite on one of my famous tangents, but just a little bit. It's really my introduction to the First World War, because I am going to lose a great uncle during this battle. He was serving in the PALS. A little bit more about him later, but was my father telling me that when he was a young man growing up in Hull, on the day of the battle, the 3rd of May, it used to be a day of mourning in Hull, and everybody would walk about. My dad was born in 1920, direct result of his grandfather or his father returning from the First World War, and he remembered everybody wearing black armbands. People all wore black armbands because they'd lost relatives. They put black crepe paper up in their windows to signify that they'd lost a relative. And the 3rd of May in Hull for a long time, really up until the Second World War, was a day that meant as much as Armistice Day, the 11th of November, to the people of Hull, as they remembered the terrible losses during this battle that we're going to be talking about.
So, just quickly, Pete, before we start our walk, what were the Hull's pals up to between the Battle of the Somme and this fight in May 1917?
Well, there's just one further action, and it's the last gambit, really, of the Battle of the Somme. It's the Battle of the Ancre, which is the 13th of November, so just before the Battle of the Somme, the bigger Battle of the Somme finishes, and they're attacking the same place. They're attacking in Serre, and they're having a similar amount of luck, but this time they were used, so they did take fairly heavy casualties, but they're spread among the battalions, and as we're going to see, the casualties are 800, and you'd have to say that probably a third of those were immediately dead. And you're thinking, well, that sounds terrible in its own right. It is terrible, but it's not going to be as terrible as the battle at Oppy Wood. So they still, because we had a big reserve still left, they were still able to fill most of those places with the reserve. So as we get into 1917 and towards the 3rd of May, then they still have that feel of coming from one geographic area, which most of the other PALS battalions did not.
Well, now we're moving forward to the action we're going to be following, Oppy Wood. Tell us a little bit, very briefly, about where it is and why it's important and why it became significant for the Hull PALS.
Okay, well, Oppy it's a very quiet area, I have to say, and it's not particularly well visited. It's not an area that people, now I know this is the wrong thing to say, but you'll know what I mean. It's not the sexy part of the battlefield. It's not the Battle of the Somme. It's not Passchendaele. It's not Vimy Ridge. It isn't just as important as all of the rest, but it's not one that fires people's imagination. You could have to say that most of the Battle of Arras doesn't particularly fire people's imagination. Let's hope that's changing. I think it is. I think people are starting to explore all the aspects, those that are interested, all aspects of the battlefields now. So it's not that visited. It's funny enough, in preparing for this podcast, I've been looking at what's online, what was available online, just refreshing my memory, and amazingly very little. You know, there's not lots of pictures of the memorials in Oppy or the village. So yeah, it's not the same as when you're researching the Somme. So Oppy itself, a small village, it's about 11 kilometres northeast of Arras. Population 400. I always use my village as a kind of a guideline. My village's population of around about 200. Well, I have to say, it doesn't feel any larger than my village, so they must be spread out quite a bit, because the village is quite a small village. Of course, because it was flattened like all of the others, it looks similar. All the houses are fairly much the same style of brickwork. The church, Art Deco, as a lot of them are. It's a very Art Deco church. No attempt to reproduce what had been there before, so we have a very Art Deco church. But the most striking thing in the square in the middle of the village, well, there's two memorials really that are striking. The first one that we'll talk about is, that's where we're going to stand. So we'll start off with, we're going to stand in front of the French village memorial. So this is just the village memorial, and it's to the glorious dead of the village of Oppy. But it's a very interesting one. It's not like a lot of war memorials in the area. It's a lot more warlike. This is a French soldier, grenade in hand. He's got the parapet behind him, throwing his grenade over the parapet. We see a German steel helmet in front of him. And that's interesting, because very often the depiction is of a pickelhaube, that spiky, pointy leather helmet that we see in the early days of the war and kind of recognise straight away when we think of the Germans. But it's depicting, on this memorial, it's depicting the steel helmet. So it's talking about the helmet of the period when the village was fought over, 1917, and so I enjoy this memorial. I think it's an interesting one. It's as I've said this several times when we've been doing this podcast, go and have a look at the local French memorial, worthwhile to go and have a look at. But then across the lawned area, with the wood behind it. So the wood actually comes right into the heart of the village here. And so the Oppy Wood, the famous wood, is behind it. And we are actually, where we're standing is the German fortified village. This was held by the Germans. So to get to the wood, to get to the village, then the Hull Pals are going to have to come. The 92nd Brigade is going to have to come through the wood and round both sides of it. And so we can see the wood behind the memorial. And what is that memorial? Well, it's a memorial to the city of Hull. So very unusual to have a memorial commemorating a city. So it's not just to the Hull Pals, the 92nd Infantry Brigade. It is commemorating Hull on the Western Front. A lot of people don't realise that. They just think it's commemorating those men from Hull who died fighting here. It isn't. And so you have to say, why isn't it in Hull? Well, I'm not so sure. I don't know why it isn't in the city centre. We have a little or a large cenotaph there, but we don't have anything as touching as this, as moving as this. So what does it look like? Well, it's a big Christian cross with Christ on the cross. So we have Christ on the cross. And you actually walk up steps to get to it. So it's a big memorial. So you walk up the steps to get to Christ on the cross. Behind it, if you walk back down the steps and go behind it, there is a long curving wall. And there's a seat, and straight away it gives you a clue here. This was built for pilgrims. This was built for people to sit around the memorial and to have a think about what went on here, because this was the place that people came from Hull. If you were coming to the Western Front or on one of the large tours in the 1920s, the pilgrim tours, then this would be included. Not now. Very few people or very few coaches will go to, unless it's very specific and they're following the PALS battalions, then they may come here. But it's not a place that's visited very often. It's a great shame because it is designed. This memorial was designed for people to sit on these seats behind and around the memorial and to contemplate. I'm very lucky. Before I lost my father, we came here together to the memorial. And I've got lots of pictures of us standing together, arm in arm, remembering his uncle, my great uncle, and all of the other lads from Hull who fought in the Great War and are commemorated here on this memorial.
If you're a regular listener to our podcast, you would know that Pete and I are quite fascinated by this period immediately after the First World War, the great pilgrimages. And again, I think as an Australian, we don't quite understand the significance of it because Australians sadly never had the opportunity to participate. The idea that an Australian would be able to travel to Europe and walk the battlefields where their son had been killed was just beyond the reach of most Australians at that time in the 1920s and the 1930s. But not so far from England. So even the working families had the opportunity to take a long weekend and catch a ferry across on a train and come to these sites where they'd lost sons and brothers and fathers. And it's a fascinating chapter. You go back through all of our podcasts and you'll hear us talking about it. To me, it's almost as fascinating as the story of the war itself, the collective grief that followed this first huge world war and the tangible reminders that we still have on the battlefields today of those pilgrims that came over. So I always like to say that when we go to the memorials and the cemeteries, the creators knew that they would be there for centuries after the original families had all long gone. Yet at the same time, there was a genuine need to build memorials, cemeteries, and facilities that would enable literally hundreds of thousands of people to come and pay their respects to lost family members. It's just a fascinating chapter of history, isn't it, Pete?
It is indeed, and it's something that has always fascinated me. And being a bit of a collector, I can't help myself. I like collecting the souvenirs associated with their visits. So the photographs that they took of each other standing in front of the memorials, the rail tickets that they paid for, the badges that they wore if they're in organised groups. And it's a fascinating and very moving aspect of the war, especially when you get the close-up pictures of grieving parents with their standing behind their son's headstone. And I think those are probably some of the most moving photographs that certainly as I have in my collection, and that you can see. It brings it home to you straight away that this is not just about fighting, adventure and excitement, which for a lot of these young chaps, that's what they thought it was going to be. This is about loss, memory, and heartbreak, really. And coming here, you can sitting on this seat with a memorial in front of you, then you can think about that. And certainly when I was there with my father, that's what we thought about.
So where to next on our, was it a bimble around?
Yeah, a bimble.
Around Oppy?
So we're just going to go around the wood. So I'm just going to try and put it in perspective again. So this is a wood that is in front of the village, and we are attacking from the far side of that wood. and one battalion is being held in reserve, and we have 3 battalions that are in the attack. So the 12th, and this is us now looking from the far side of the wood. You have to use your imagination here. We're looking into the wood, and beyond the wood we can see the remnants of the village, and that's where we're standing now, within that village. But imagine you're on the other side. And we've got the 12th East Yorks on the left. We've got the 11th East Yorks, which will have to push through the wood, and the 10th East Yorks on the right. Now, what I need to say straight away is this is a disaster. Now, you knew I was going to say that because, of course, what we're commemorating are the terrible losses. So very few people will get through the wood at all. On the right-hand side, some of the 10th Battalion actually managed to get into the village. Now, we don't know this until later on, or perhaps even after the war, because those guys were taken prisoner. They didn't get back. So it's and we'll be discussing why it's a disaster in a second, but it's a terrible disaster. So what we're going to do is we're going to now go walk our way slowly around until we're on the side of where they're attacking from. And the first thing we're actually going to bump into is a post. It's just a straightforward post. Now, I have to say, and hold my hand up here, I have not seen this post. This is fairly recent, and it's commemorating Victoria Cross action, and it's a chap who gave his life here as an officer. He's called Second Lieutenant Jack Harrison. His actual name was John, but everybody knew him as Jack. And he lost his life taking a machine gun position. We're going to read his citation in a minute by himself, and purely a selfish act. I think by then they knew they weren't going to go any further forward, but he just feels this machine gun has to be taken out. I think it's to allow his men to either dig in and try and hold the land or to fall back, and so he will lose his life there. For me, he was somebody who I've known about almost all my life. And I was very lucky that for a short period, I actually owned his memorial scroll. So something that was given to his wife, and eventually, sadly, lost. It was actually found on a rubbish dump, and it's the memorial scroll that came with the death plaque and the medals. One of the part of the things that were given to the families on their deaths. And so for a short period, I owned this. So I felt very honoured to have owned it, and I know it went to yet another good home from myself. So he was a true Hull man. He'd been born in Hull. He'd become a teacher in Hull. He'd actually went to York to be educated, which York is, if anybody's been to York, a very nice place to go to. Very famous for the Romans and the ruins. I'm going to go off in a tangent if I'm not careful, so I'm going to draw myself back in. And he taught in one of the rougher schools in Hull, actually called Lime Street School. I've got in my notes here, rough as hell. So it's near the Docklands area, the docks of Hull, when the docks were going flat out. But what I'm also interested in, he was a very keen sportsman, and he played for Hull FC, and in 1914 they were in the cup final, and he scored one of the winning tries, and they successfully beat Wakefield 6.
I believe in football that's actually known as a goal, not a try.
No, it's rugby. So
he's playing rugby.
He is, but we call it rugby football, and here it's just at that time they just called it football. So just to confuse things, it's like football in Australia.
Hull FC is a rugby club.
It is, yeah.
Fascinating. And they only won the game 6-0, so okay.
Yeah.
Hence my confusion.
Yeah, indeed. So this was the Challenge Cup in 1914. Crowd, just a matter of interest, crowd of 19,000. So enormous crowds at that time. And he was late in joining, I have to say, because he had so much going on, a teacher, a sportsman, etc., etc. He didn't actually apply for a commission. He went to an officer training college, and commissioned on the 4th of August in 1916. And then, obviously, because of his background, he went to the East Yorkshire Regiment and to the 11th Battalion, and commanded C Company during this attack. Sadly, like most of the guys who were killed during this fighting, he is on the memorial to the missing in Arras, because that's where the soldiers who were missing in this area end up on the Arras Memorial to the Missing. A place we've not been, Matt, and I'd quite like to go there. On one of our podcasts, I think we need to go to the Arras Memorial to the Missing. It's a fascinating area there as well. As is sadly my great uncle, he's also on that memorial, and he was serving in the 12th Battalion, and he's Arthur Smith, difficult man to research for obvious reasons. But he is
perhaps when we're allowed to travel and walk the battlefields again, Pete, we should do a live podcast as we go and visit some of these sites around Arras.
Yeah,
because there's a lot of good ones to see.
Yeah, I agree entirely. And interestingly, the Arras Memorial. No, I'm going to spoil the Arras talk, the memorial talk, but you cannot see his name very clearly. I often feel like taking some step ladders. He's right at the top on one of the panels to go and get a good photograph of his name. Like, you can't really photograph it from the floor. So I'm just going to read you Jack Harrison's MC. He'd already been awarded the MC, so his VC citation. For most conspicuous bravery and self-sacrifice in an attack, owing to darkness and to smoke from the enemy barrage and from our own, to the fact that our objective was a dark wood, it was impossible to see where our barrage had lifted off the enemy front line. And it gives you an idea of the confusion here. This is a night attack, and there was an awful lot of confusion, an awful lot of a lack of shell fire from our point of view, so no proper creeping barrage. And what there had been, this barrage that moves forward at the same speed that you are, they were supposed to be 50 paces behind it. They lost touch with it, and in fact they lost it. They weren't even sure where the barrage had gone. Nevertheless, Second Lieutenant Harrison led his company against the enemy trench under heavy rifle and machine gun fire, but was repulsed. Reorganising his command as best he could in no man's land, he again attacked in darkness under terrific fire, but with no success. Then turning round, this gallant officer single-handedly made a dash at the machine gun, hoping to knock out the gun and so save the lives of many of his company. His self-sacrifice and absolute disregard of danger was an inspiring example to all. He is reported missing, believed killed, and that was absolutely correct. Now, I've got another little chapter heading here, which I think is something that is interesting. How did Hull react to the terrible news of these appalling casualties? And just to give you an idea, 1,000 men in the battalion, let's say 700, 800 in the attack. Well, most of these battalions were at half strength by the end of this fighting. And yet, when we look at the casualty records, they don't appear to be, or any casualty is bad. But the 10th Battalion was reporting 100 men dead, 11th Battalion 63 men dead, and the 12th Battalion 83 men dead. And it gives you a completely wrong impression, because that doesn't include the missing, which the majority will be dead. It doesn't include those that will die and that's why we use the term casualties, that will die later on because of their wounds. It doesn't even include those that have been taken prisoner. So it's, if you look at the outright dead at the roll calls, then it doesn't appear to be too terrible. It's only later on, when they start compiling the figures, that we realise how bad the casualties were. And so, well, in fact, some of the battalions, 2 of them were down to 2 companies at the end, so literally only less than a third of the men returning from the fighting.
Just horrific.
Yeah, it certainly was. So how did Hull react to it? Well, interestingly, I've researched and been interested in the Hull papers at this time for a long, long time, and what you find is that there's no sudden outcry. Well, of course there wouldn't be, because by the time we get to 1917, the newspapers have been pumping out these list of casualties day after day after day, with biographies of a lot of the men. And in fact, there was almost a knee-jerk reaction to it in the end. We've got to stop doing this. This is terrible. This is depressing, and people are not buying the newspapers anymore. If you think of it from a financial point of view, we need to stop putting so much information about the casualties in the newspapers. So what we get now we're getting to just lists. But the lists are not great, and there's a very good reason why the lists are not great, because the majority of these men who have been killed are missing. So nobody is getting that terrible telegram that is saying your relative is dead. They're going to start receiving telegrams that are saying that they're missing, and sometimes presumed dead. But it's missing is the key here. So we don't get this instant impact in Hull where everybody's going, oh my God, what has happened? It's appalling. I'm going to go off on a little tangent here. What is very interesting about Hull is Hull, along with, I can't remember which other, there's another town in England that did this as well. But Hull is famous for its street shrines. Every street in Hull, or the majority of streets in Hull, started sticking up shrines at the end of the street. And sometimes they were very ornate and very well produced, and sometimes they were just a pot of flowers with something pasted on the wall with a list of all the men that are enlisted from the street. But they started vying with each other. So the shrines got bigger, the flowers got bigger, they built glass cabinets, they did all sorts. They listed the men from the streets, and then they marked on them the ones that had been killed. And you can buy photographs of those streets. If you go to the junk shops and rummage around and look online, you can get photographs of these shrines, and you can see they're fantastic and they're very, very interesting. There are just a few that survive to this day in Hull, but it was a big part of the life in Hull. They felt proud, and the streets felt proud as to how many men had enlisted from each street, and so they are where you would have gone and started to realise how bad the casualties were becoming.
It's that local commemoration that's fascinating as well, to imagine those shrines with those names being crossed off or marked as men were killed from the street is just appalling. And I think the same thing whenever I go to war memorials in Australia. There's one at Manly, for example, on the beach in Sydney, and in my hometown in West Wyalong. But you often see these large memorials with panels all over them that are now full of names. But you think when the memorials were constructed during the First World War, often quite early during the First World War, they had to have the foresight to leave these panels blank, knowing that they would be filling them with names as the war went on. And what did that mean for the families whose sons were away serving, to walk past that memorial every day and see those huge blank panels just waiting to be filled? You know, the dread that was looming in those panels, waiting to be filled with names of the dead from that local community. Just awful. The stresses of the families having to deal with their sons being away for this length of time and in many cases eventually being killed was just enormous.
I'm going to off on a tangent. I can't help it. This is definitely tangent time. In the centre of England, we have something called the National Arboretum. Have you been to the National Arboretum, Matt?
I have not, no.
It's where the Memorial to Modern Warfare is. And the Memorial to Modern Warfare is a series of carving walls. It has some beautiful bronzes in the middle. It's got a medic bending over a chap on a stretcher, and a little door behind her. And on the 11th, the 11th of the 11th, the rising sun shines through the crack in the door and lights up her face. So very cleverly designed. But it's the carving walls, because the carving walls are blank. They are waiting each year. The year is put on, and the names of those British soldiers, airmen, sailors, who died in conflict are then put onto that wall. So it's one of the most shocking aspects of it. It's designed for the future with these blank walls. And so it's an amazing memorial, well worth going there. It's also, the National Arboretum is where we put all of our war memorials now. New war memorials are put there. The memorial to the shot at dawn is there. There are memorials to the Arctic convoys. The memorial to the Falklands War is there. So it's a fantastic place to go if you're interested in memorials and warfare, I suppose.
Sounds extraordinary. I'll certainly check it out next time I'm over in Europe, whenever that may be. I'm just noting your biography here of Jack Harrison, who won the VC, and his memorial that led to this discussion in the first place. Also, his son served in the Second World War. Tell us briefly about his son.
He did. This is terrible because his son was born obviously while he was serving, or just before he left to go on service, because he married during the war. And whether he saw his son or not, I'm not sure whether he'd actually met his son. I've got a feeling he did see his son before he went off to war. But of course, with him being killed, there was then a shortage of money, and money was raised for his education. So he actually had a very good education, because it was paid for by people donating. And by the time of the Second World War, he was a captain in the Duke of Wellington's, the West Riding Regiment. And sadly, he lost his life at Dunkirk. He was with the Duke of Wellington's actually held the perimeter as they were evacuating, and he was killed while holding the perimeter. So yeah, terrible end of the family line. And in fact, I know the whole story of that, because his mum then was left with nobody, because he was the only child. And eventually, when the scroll that I owned was found, it was found on a rubbish dump. When she died, they cleared the house out, and it was thrown away. So it's she'd actually thankfully donated the Victoria Cross to the Regimental Museum, so it's held in the Regimental Museum. But somehow or other, the scroll was not.
how many more of those little stories are out there, Pete, of families torn apart by both world wars? Just awful. The same in Australia. I come across it all the time of young men killed in the First World War and then their sons killed in the Second World War. Just terrible, the impact of those two huge wars.
I think it's one of the sadder aspects, isn't it? Is that my father, who didn't fight in the Second World War because he was in a reserved occupation, was exactly the right age for fighting in the Second World War. He was born in 1920, and of course, my grandfather would have had him thinking that the world is now safe. I've just been involved in the war to end all wars. I can have my children, not have to worry about what's coming. And of course, sadly, all of the chaps that went down that line and had children in 1920 or thereabouts, they're going to be exactly the right age to fight in the Second World War.
Terrible stuff, mate. Let's hope it doesn't happen again.
Indeed, yeah, indeed.
Where else in Oppy are we exploring?
Right, well, we're just going to carry on walking around the woods. I've just put here nuances, really. You have to look carefully when you're walking around these locations, these battlefield locations. We just have a little roadside marker here. It's on the side of the road, N50, and just beneath it, it says Hull, 580 kilometres. So it's the searches. I just found that just fascinating. We have these little nuances of the battlefield. I just want to go back a little bit. I forgot to mention something. That the land where the memorial is, this is the Hull Memorial to the Kingston upon Hull Memorial, and that's the other thing I should just say. Hull is not its full title. It is Kingston upon Hull, but everybody just knows Hull as Hull or Hull. And the land was donated by I can't even pronounce. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce this. It's a viscount and a viscountess. They donated the land because their son had been killed in 1918, and they felt that they wanted to give something back to the town that had offered so many of its own dead to try and take Oppy back under French control. So they donated the piece of land, which I think is fascinating in its own right and moving.
Reading your notes, mate, I respect your efforts not to attempt to pronounce that incredible French name, but we do pay our respects to them nonetheless.
We do.
So what's our next stop on the walk?
This one, you'd have to jump in your car. And I think, so let's imagine that we've walked right the way around the wood. And in walking round the wood, we've walked right into the frontline German positions. They are on the far side of the wood. Nothing there now at all. You can't go into the wood. I've always been a little aggrieved that you can't go into the wood. You can understand why. There's always been people that are interested in having a poke about. It's a shooting wood. It's one that's used for coppicing and for taking the timber out for firewood mainly. So it's protected. You can't go into it, but you can certainly walk around it and have a good gander through the fence. And in fact, it has got a very good barbed wire fence right the way around, so you can't even sneak into it as you can with some. I wouldn't suggest you do, of course, but with some you can. So we're going to walk back into town and back to the church itself. Now, inside the church, there are a few little memorials that have been placed on the walls commemorating Hull, and I think one of the stained glass windows in there as well was paid for by the city in the rebuilding of the church. I have to say, it's a little while since I've been myself. Obviously, for 18 months now, we've not been really able to travel, but even before then, I spend a lot of time, my guiding time, on the Australian battlefield. So I'm looking forward to going back. Having done this podcast, I want to go back as soon as we are able. The question I put a little note here is, well, where do they lie? Those that were killed here in this battle, where do they lie? Well, that's a very good question, because a lot of them are still in the landscape around us, as we've discussed an awful lot in these podcasts. But in this case, there is a cemetery that's close by called Orchard Dump Cemetery. Fairly horrible name when you think dump, because it gives you horrible connotations of the dumping of bodies. That's not where the name comes from at all. It's the dumping of ammunition, the dumping of supplies. It's normally a crossover point. A dump area is where they're dumping off supplies and picking up supplies, but of course it's also a medical crossover area where perhaps stretcher bearers are bringing wounded men back. They're leaving them there. They're then being picked up. So it's a changeover point. Normally involves some kind of medical post, and they're going to be evacuated from that position. So that's the dump aspect. So it's not to do with dumping bodies. So Orchard Dump Cemetery gives you another clue. There's probably an orchard close by. And it has 3,000 graves or commemorations. Some of them are on panels, but 3,000 soldiers commemorated, the majority with graves. But of that 3,000, 2,200 are unknown. So the bulk of this cemetery is soldiers that we don't know who they are. We may sometimes know the regiments, but we don't know who they are. And if you walk up and down the gravestones, you'll see East York badges everywhere here. So again, it's one of the terrible aspects. The recovery of bodies here was almost impossible.
Well, it's just fascinating, Pete. I mean, it's so important after we walk an action like this to go and see where the men who were killed there lie. And isn't it wonderful to be able to, not wonderful, that's not the right word, but isn't it appropriate that we can walk the ground, see where they fought and died, and then go and pay our respects to them in a big cemetery like this one, and reflect on the fact that so many are still missing, that so many are unknown, so many were lost and have no known grave. Just an extraordinary action and an extraordinary walk around an important little corner of the Western Front.
I think wonderful is not a bad word, Matt. To my mind, I mean, this is where we presume, because we'd like to think he had a grave. He may not, but my great uncle, this is where we presume he is, and we've picked a grave some years ago. My father and myself, we picked a grave, and we said, okay, this is now going to be our great uncle. Now, we don't know that it is at all, but it is what lots of people do exactly the same. They pick a soldier of the regiment, and possibly some of these guys are dated. We know what day they died, so that's even better if you can find one that was killed on the right day as well, still unknown, of course. And then you can imagine that he may be your relative, and you can place your wreath and your poppies there, and that's what we do when we come here. There's another very unusual aspect of this cemetery as well. Every Commonwealth War Grave cemetery has a plaque on the wall, which actually basically says that it was, I'm paraphrasing here, but it was given by the French in perpetuity, in other words, or the Belgians in perpetuity. In other words, it was given to us for forever, for our use. Here, it's very different. It says that it's a gift of Madame Wartel to the memory of her husband, who was a captain in the 72nd French Infantry, who fell on the field of honour on the 27th of August 1914. So it's another gift. This is a gift of a landowner who is saying, I am going to give you this land for you to bury your dead in, and I'm giving it to you in perpetuity. So very unusual. I don't think I've ever seen an inscription on a wall in any other cemetery that says who gifted it.
Just fascinating, Pete. The whole walk has been fascinating, both for a battlefield perspective, but also that connection with your hometown back in England. Just really extraordinary, mate. Thank you so much for sharing it. Anything else you'd like to add before we wrap the walk up today?
There's for those that are interested in paintings, there's a beautiful painting by and it's a painting of its time. It's got that arty deco feel. John Nash, and it's called Oppy Wood, 1917 Evening, and it gives you an idea, because the one thing that I mustn't let you go away thinking that we are talking about, we have discussed this before, but it's well worth reiterating. When we discuss fighting in woods, by the time the soldiers get to grips with an enemy anywhere near a wood during the Great War, you can fairly much say that the wood no longer exists. It is just twisted and destroyed branches, and certainly there are some very good aerial photographs of Oppy Wood at this period. And yes, there are standing trees here, but the majority of them have been sheared off at knee height or just above, and there's basically split and timber, bits of timber and roots everywhere. So they were very, very difficult to fight within, and especially if you're fighting within the dark. I should just say that this battle took place, I think it was 3:35 that it started in the morning, and it was not a good time, because it's not going to get lighter for a couple of hours, and so most of the tough fighting was done in complete darkness. And yet there had been a terrible aspect prior to that when we formed up, so when the battalions formed up, it was a full moon. So the forming up in preparation of the battle was done in very bright moonlight, and it was behind us, so the Germans could see us. And that's why we have so many casualties, because even before the battle started, the full moon silhouetted the men forming up, and they were shelled unbelievably heavily before 0 hour.
Well, Pete, thank you so much for sharing this walk with us again. One that I never would have done had you not suggested it, and just important to remember the men from Hull, and indeed all the men who died in these actions, these lesser known actions on the Western Front. It's important we don't forget them. So thank you so much for sharing this one with us.
We'll put it on the list of places that I need to take you, Matt.
Mate, I can't wait. Let's hope that this virus allows us to do that before too long. We're seeing some light at the end of the tunnel, and I can't wait to get back there, Pete, and walk the ground with you. And this one will be right at the top of the list.
Good.